Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Special Education Legal Fund's March webinar, Understanding Residential Outplacement. My name is Christine Lai, and I am the Executive Director and co-founder of SELF. And I'm so pleased to welcome our panelists and our attendees to tonight's session. First of all, Special Education Legal Fund is deeply thankful for the support of our corporate parent education program partners. This month's webinar concludes the first year of our corporate sponsorship program. When we started SELF 4-ish years ago, we were committed to leveling the playing field for families in need with children in the special education system. What we've learned in the intervening time is that we don't know what we don't know. And we don't know this about special education, about legal and advocacy issues, and about educational options for our children. So our corporate sponsorship program allows SELF to bring these webinars to you and hopefully provide you with knowledge, information, and resources to help in your child's journey. We are deeply grateful to the inaugural corporate sponsorship partners, beginning with Winston Preparatory School, with whom we've had a long-term supportive relationship that extends back before our founding. We are also incredibly grateful to American School for the Deaf and Chapel Haven Schliefer Center for their steadfast support of our mission. We've been blessed to have the support of Pinnacle School and the Spire School in our first year, as well as Fusion Academy, Villa Maria, and Hubbard Day School. We are delighted as part of this to welcome our 2022 corporate partners, Winston Preparatory School at the gold level, and at the silver level, American School for the Deaf, Chapel Haven Schliefer Center, Shrub Oak International School, and Villa Maria School. And at the bronze level, we have Eagle Hill School and the Windward School. And so thank you to all of our sponsors, both past and present. Before we start this webinar, I wanted to share a few words about Special Education Legal Fund. SELF was founded in 2018 to provide grants for families in need for children in the special education system. Since our founding, we've provided over $450,000 in grants to 150 families in over 50 school districts across Connecticut and Westchester County. We are an entirely volunteer nonprofit organization founded by parents for parents. Our mission, really since before we were founded, was to provide families with knowledge and resources so they could better navigate and understand the special education system. A little plug for next month's webinar. Next month's webinar is actually a collaboration with the Youth Mental Health Project. We are really excited about this because it is an important topic today, the topic of mental health among our students with special education needs. In this webinar, we are going to draw from a variety of expert perspectives, attorney, advocate, psychologist, and parent, to help parents understand the particular mental health needs of their students and how schools and the law can help provide supports for students struggling with mental health issues. As I said, we're pleased to collaborate with the Youth Mental Health Project. We welcome Valerie Barton, their executive director, as well as special education attorney Dana Johnson, advocate Diane Wilcuts, and Dr. Adrian Smaller from Yale. Sign up the same way you did for this one on Eventbrite. It's April 6th, same time. And now I'm going to do just a couple words about our legal assistance program, which is our flagship program. This program provides families in need with up to $5,000 in legal support. We review these grants on a monthly basis during the school year. And to begin the process, you have to visit our website at spedlegalfund.org. Programs, it's at the bottom of the page here. The legal assistance program has 3 requirements. One is that you must meet an income level, which you see on this chart in the far column based on the people in your household. You must have a child or children with an IEP, and you must reside in Connecticut or Westchester County, New York. After starting the process, visit our website at any time to start the pre-screening process on the programs page. After you've pre-screened, you'll receive an application, which you'll return by email or mail by the 15th of the month. This month's deadline is March 15th. After we received your application, we will then conduct a phone interview. You have until the 22nd of each month to complete that interview. And then all applicants to the program will be reviewed, their application will be reviewed, and the family will be notified by the end of the month. So by this month, for March, it's March 31st. And now introducing Paul Barger. We are so excited to have Paul back for, what is this, your third
time? My third, yeah.
I think it is your third time in our webinar series. We're really excited. Paul is a partner at Barger & Gaines in Westchester, New York, and he practices special education law on behalf of families in New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Michigan. Paul has particular expertise in these residential special education placements and does speak nationally on this topic on a regular basis. And we are thrilled to have Paul back for this panel. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Meredith Braxton, we would like to welcome to our panel. We are really excited to welcome Meredith to this panel for a repeat performance, glorious repeat performance. Those of us who live in and around the lower Fairfield County area, and particularly in Greenwich, know Meredith and her special education practice well. She's a strong and vocal presence in the special education legal community, who previously was a magazine editor who, after law school, practiced corporate law in New York City. Her special education interest in special education law was piqued when her children were born, and she had some issues learning to read. And her advocacy for her own children inspired her special education law practice and what she does advocating for other families. So thank you, Meredith, for joining us. Now we'd like to welcome Gerry McFaddon to our panel. Gerry, this is Gerry's first time for a self panel, and we're really pleased to welcome her to this panel. Gerry has extensive experience in New York, Connecticut. She was previously a partner in a Michigan law firm, and we're really excited to have Gerry because when I first came to this area, in my personal life, Gerry's was one of the names that, I heard most often, most frequently, and most loudly from parents who had been her previous clients and supporters. So we're thrilled to have Gerry join us, not only on this webinar, but in the self community as a whole. So we're super excited. Thanks, Gerry. And our last panelist is Piper Paul. Piper is, last but not least, she's a great friend and supporter of self, and also great friend and supporter of mine. I think this is your second or third panel appearance. I don't know. It's hard to count. Evaluation. She's actually done an in-person panel for us, 2 in-person panels for us back when we were still doing those things. So we're really pleased to welcome Piper back to the webinar version of our series. And because this wouldn't be any kind of webinar without a disclaimer, here we go. This webinar panel is presented for informational purposes only. This webinar is intended as a resource for families who are navigating the special education system and is not intended to provide legal support, advice, or assistance to any particular individual, nor is it intended to replace the advice and counsel of a qualified special education attorney. This webinar should not be construed as endorsement by Special Education Legal Fund or any of its representatives of any of the participating attorneys on the panel. For webinar participants, this panel should be viewed as a public forum. Please do not ask questions about your child or your child's legal or educational situation with specific information about your child or your family. Please email questions to me at christine@spedlegalfund.org. I will put that information in the chat. And again, in your email, please refrain from any comments that include identifiable information about your child, including but not limited to name, grade, school, or school district. Please remember that your screen name may be visible to the participants in the panel, as well as the panelists and Special Education Legal Fund. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and may be distributed or shown at a later date at the discretion of Special Education Legal Fund. So here we are, understanding residential outplacement. Is that possible? Can we do that? Before we start, I'd like to, throw out to the panel, perhaps we could start with a review of the outplacement process, generally speaking, and then kind of go into specifically how residential outplacement differs from that. Gerry, would you like to share, kind of how the outplacement process generally works, and for the families that have joined us today?
Sure. Pretty much, I practice in Connecticut and New York, and so the outplacement process for the most part is and focusing on residential or just in general?
In general, just in general.
Okay. So it's a situation where parents have gotten to a point with their child where what the programming that's being offered in district is not appropriate. And so they are interested in looking into programs outside of the district. It operates differently in New York than in Connecticut. And I'm always, if I'm representing families and I know they are looking for an outplacement and are already kind of on that track, then it's, I prefer that they not be offered one of the state approved programs. And that is part of it in either state, that there are these state approved programs. And that's what the districts push for. By law, the Supreme Court has said they do not have to be state approved programs. It's what's appropriate for the child. But the start of the process is asking for the outplacement. And there's a lot of background work that we're usually working on with the parents to prepare so we're ready when they ask for the outplacement. And I mean, that's the initial rollout. Is you're getting your ducks in a row, so to speak, whether it's records, it's treaters, evaluations, so that you have everything you need to support the outplacement. And there are plenty of times where it's, time is of the essence. The student has to be outplaced promptly. Because for medical and educational reasons. Yeah.
So I'm going to throw this question out there for this statement, actually, for all of you, because, Gerry, you've kind of, rolled right into it. So the statement is, the IEE is the doorway to outplacement. Without it, you're not going anywhere. Can you all evaluate that statement? Is it true? Is it false? And then particularly as it applies to a residential outplacement. Paul, if you'd like to go first.
So am I allowed to disagree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I look in many, and I'm sorry to have to do that, but
no, I like, this is what we like.
Yeah. So I mean, IEs are super valuable, and having the district fund them is obviously a real benefit to many families. I will tell you that in most of our cases, especially the residential cases, and there's some reasons for this, our families are typically getting a private evaluator that they're funding. We're often have an eye towards litigation, and getting the private evaluator involved and having that right up front is important. I will also tell you, a lot of times, specifically in residential cases, a lot of the families that I represent, the students often in a wilderness program first on their way to a residential program, residential school, and the neuropsychological evaluation typically takes place while they're in the wilderness program. So there wouldn't be an opportunity for an IE. So for a residential case, I would say that an IE is not really the gateway towards the case and getting an outplacement. It really, but I will say,
but you do need the evaluation.
So that's what I was going to say. So in general, though, speaking, regardless of whether it's an IE or a private evaluation funded by the family, in any special education case, but typically in cases involving outplacement, the evaluation is everything. That is the starting point. That should be guiding the process. It shouldn't be the other way around.
You need that witness in the chair to recommend the outplacement, because you're not going to get it from anybody from the school district. Probably every now and then you have that, lightning struck case where you do get that from someone in the school district or a psychiatrist the school district, brings in actually makes that recommendation, but those cases are few and far between.
Mhm.
So but
Piper?
you need that expert.
Yeah.
So my background is many years ago was in homicide investigation. That's kind of how I approach cases. You need a lot of things. You have to have some kind of an evaluation, but what you really need are the experts that are going to recommend the program and clearly be able to delineate the reasons and stand by it.
Mhm.
And the more that you have, the better. If you come in and don't have an evaluation and don't have anyone, that will be problematic.
Mhm.
So it's an interesting question. It's a little mixed on the answer.
Always good that way. Gerry, what are your thoughts on my controversial statement?
So I thought I was going to have to be the first one to disagree. So thank you, Paul. Because what I have found is I agree with everybody that the evaluation, that very thorough, comprehensive evaluation that you will not get within the school district from their people is critical. But what I find is there's other ways to get that. And it's without the ever increasing battles
Mhm.
districts when parents request an IEE. So for me, what I'm looking at is, I check with the parents on how good is your insurance, and is there a way that your insurance would fund the evaluation.
Mhm.
Some of the parents, many of the parents pay privately.
Yeah.
I have had a fair amount of luck, not in New York, but in Connecticut, with mutually agreed upon evaluators. So
Mhm.
we cut out the idea of that there's going to be our evaluation and the board's evaluation,
Mhm.
and it's going to get very complicated. So we agree upon an evaluator that I have had experience with, and I know their focus is the child. The
Mhm.
focus is what it should be and what you get in a truly private eval. But I do think the IE for me is that if the parents have to fight about it, we're losing time.
Yeah.
It's expensive, and I would rather let's get it moving
Mhm.
because we want to be first too.
Yeah.
Some of the testing can't be repeated for a certain period of time, or there's what's referred to as a practice effect or rehearsal effect.
Mhm.
So that's my position on it.
You bring it.
I
Oh, sorry. Go
think
ahead.
I think that's been affected by, like, 5 years ago. Generally, when you asked for an IEE in most Connecticut school districts, they just said yes, and you got your IEE. Now all of them file for due process.
Mhm.
It's like LRP had some kind of training they
Yeah.
all went to,
Yeah.
and they all started filing. And now it's a slug, and those are hard cases to win,
Yeah.
and they're not worth the amount of money you have to spend to win them.
Right.
And you'll probably lose it. So
You and I were talking about this weekend, actually. The idea that, a few years ago you could just request an IEE and you would get one is, has largely, at least in my experience, receded. Is everybody seeing that is everybody seeing that? And is that, like, kind of jurisdictionally, like, not just in Connecticut, but everywhere?
It seems to be, is what I've observed is that it's, they're fighting.
Yeah.
They're not going to just roll over with it because they know they're kicking out a pretty significant percentage of families because they won't go forward with it or can't.
Yeah.
I would say that in New Jersey, they're definitely fighting. New York's not quite as much, but I would say definitely Connecticut and New Jersey, and it's definitely on the rise in New York. It's an easy thing for the districts to fight. It just puts a roadblock in for the families.
Yeah.
And to everybody else's points, I mean, we end up losing time, and especially when you're talking about residential placements, these are very, very expensive schools. And not that I want the family to have to spend more money, but at some point, we have to get that evaluation, invest the money in that, given what we're talking about, the expense of the program, the length of time that it can be.
Yeah, yeah.
Christine, I mean, I wanted to say timing is really pivotal in all these decisions. So if you have enough evaluations and the facts are exceedingly strong as to why a residential placement or outplacement is needed, you don't wait around for further evaluations. You got to move. And the other issue on timing is, I forgot, but there's a lot of timing pieces that come into evaluations and how many evaluations, and you don't want to delay a case.
Yeah.
When you have enough,
Because
then
you're
you're
fighting
going to
over
lose your
the,
opportunity.
over the
The
IEP.
district's going to fix things, and
Yeah.
now your case. The longer you wait, sometimes your case can get weaker if they start trying to change
fixing,
things.
you know, messing with things. That's really interesting. I'd like to kind of back it up a little bit and talk about, you know, more broadly, like in your practices, you know, when do you see families looking for residential outplacement? Like when does a student need it? You know, like what are the sort of, you know, flags in your in your family's mind, your mind, you know, that drive that, you know, that like, oh, this isn't like we've done, you know, several stops on the continuum, you know, from, you know, private special ed to therapeutic day to, you know, what is the, you know, what's kind of the tipping point for your families in terms of what they're looking at of the residential outplacement?
Yeah, what I would say is that all options have been exhausted. I don't think any parent wants to send their child away, especially when they have significant disabilities. So it really, all options have to have been exhausted, including like if it was a therapeutic day with tremendous supports. And then you need the evaluators to weigh in as to what is recommended and why. So it's often on the students, it can be different. It could be different sometimes in the transition when the kids don't have the skills and they're getting older. It can be significant mental health issues. It can be eating disorders. It can be a lot of things.
But what's the kind
whatever.
of like, what's the sort of, I guess, you know, like test, you know, where you're like, okay, like they need the residential piece, you know, the therapeutic day program is not enough. You know, what makes it so that like residential component is necessary and therefore should be funded, you know, as a whole for this student?
What I find is that it's the first thought that came to my mind when you asked the question was hospitalizations, and I mean emergency room visits because of
repeated, because of
attempts, self-harm, and I don't see it always being it's not neat and tidy, the process for them. And it really depends on the family, because I've had families where the professionals think the child needs a residential. I, in my humble opinion, as their lawyer, think the child needs a residential. And, you know, unfortunately, I've had that personal experience with one of my own also. And the parents aren't always ready for that, or it's a matter of you're looking at, is it a student that will go voluntarily, or is it going to have to be an involuntary circumstance? That's a lot of it, but it's pretty bad, pretty severe. And it sometimes sneaks up on them because they don't realize what's happening.
I mean, a lot of it seems like, sorry, go ahead, Meredith.
It can also be like purely educational, you know, kids who are very dyslexic and really need that kind of support. Like in this area, there really is no day school that goes through high school that really has that kind of support. Or, you know, kids who are on the spectrum and you really need to ramp up the transition piece, you know, as you're getting into high school, because they're not going to be able to have the executive functioning, you know, level that they need, and they're not going to be able to organize their activities of daily living for, you know, going to college, even though they're cognitively capable. So you can make out that need, and, you know, definitely the lion's share of them are therapeutic needs, you know, where you know, either they're in an emergency situation or
Right.
been in a day school, you know, situation, and clearly it's not working. You know, the kid is still not
And I
functioning
think what's important
efficiently.
to think about in terms of those, you know, those kids and the sort of the therapeutic special education, you know, setting is that, you know, a lot of those kids don't have an underlying special education issue. You know, like they don't have a learning disorder. You know, what they have is, you know, is anxiety or depression, or, you know, from some sort of, you know, you know, learning, non-LD related, you know, like issue. And so I think you're right, a lot of families, it sneaks up on them because you're talking about a kid that cognitively never had any issues, but all of a sudden won't go to school, you know, for a long period of time, or goes to school and ditches or whatever, you know, whatever maladaptive behaviors are, you know, are coming to the forefront. When you like, you know, I mean, Paul, you mentioned wilderness a little while ago, and I would like to, you know, talk a little bit about that, you know, particularly on this continuum that you know, that I've been sort of, you know, working out this year and just trying to talk about with families is really understanding the continuum and what the difference is between all of these different, you know, like gradations of school and support. You know, so you have your public school, you know, your home public school on the one hand, you have a private special education school, you know, next, you have a private therapeutic day school next, then you have therapeutic boarding school, you have wilderness program, you have residential treatment facility. Can you talk about, you know, outplacement, everyone really, not just Paul, in all of those different sort of settings?
Yes. So also in New York, there's the step in between, and this is very, very common, is after your local districts can also place in BOCES programs.
Yep. BOCES.
Or other district programs that'll take tuition students that take students into a special education program,
Yes.
then to a private day school. So wilderness program, though, I would say would fall outside of that continuum. Well, a district wouldn't place there. But wilderness program would fall outside of that continuum, because even though there are many of them do have some small academic component now,
Yeah.
a couple credits, they're really not educational programs, which is what makes it very difficult to get reimbursement for them.
Yeah.
Nearly impossible in the city you can, but not outside of the city. I mean, I haven't seen that very often, if at all. A therapeutic boarding school is an intensive therapeutic program. The next step is a residential treatment center, which is, I mean, they're similar, but a residential treatment center is a higher level of support. It's a more intensive therapeutic program. But from the least restrictive environment concept, those are the same thing. Residential is under the same category. And so those are outside of home instruction. A residential program is considered the most restrictive environment. So, but when we're talking about residential generally, we are talking about those two things, and those two types of programs, an RTC or a therapeutic boarding school.
And I'm sort of interested in, you know, hearing, I mean, all of this is like, you know, a lot of this is, you know, we're talking about, you're talking about a residential piece, you're talking about an educational piece, and you haven't mentioned it, but you're also talking about a medical piece, you know, a sort of, you know, so how do those three pieces, you know, kind of work together, particularly as relates to a placement, you know, like, because the school's responsible for education, right? You know, and
yeah, I just would jump in really quick and say,
yeah.
you'll never hear me, and I don't think my colleagues use the word medical.
No.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Yes,
medical.
of course. Right.
Yeah, no, but I want the families to hear that. Yeah.
Medical is medication management. That's about it.
Okay.
That's about it. And the Supreme Court has said medical is something that's delivered by an MD. So if it's a therapist or something like that, that is not medical.
And one of
Then I think, go ahead.
There's an interesting about this, sort of like what I think my thinking on this therapeutic residential, when students significantly have mental health challenges, when they have actual evaluations, it is, I think I've seen one, maybe, you don't see pure emotional disturbance. There's often many other things, and they're comorbid disabilities. And then the students can have adaptive, social, emotional, behavioral challenges, and those are the district's responsibility.
Right.
At the end of the day, the IEP is to go on for further education, to live as independently as possible, and to be gainfully employed. That's the key.
Mhm.
And that's why these residential programs, those are pushes for those other pieces that
Mhm.
need to be clearly integrated
Right.
in order to reach one of those IDA
Right.
directives.
Right. So that the curriculum is accessible, because in the day program, the program that is offered to the student is not reaching the child, because it's not like sort of a holistic, like 24-hour kind of program. That's kind of the test, I guess, is that it.
I think it's also right. You look at everything. I look at everything: social, emotional, adaptive, behavioral, and academic. If a student is not regulated, they cannot learn the way they should. But there's often a lot more underlying currents that have to be resolved.
Mhm.
So I think they're complex. I don't think it's black and white.
Mhm.
What you think you could get a therapeutic residential placement and others you couldn't. And I think it turns on the experts.
And that seems to be, I mean, that's obviously the theme for all outplacements, in general. How have you all found, we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but, I personally have seen a lot more demand, at least among, the clients that I see applying to our fund for support and who need a residential outplacement. A lot more kids that are coming off of a hospitalization, which I really didn't see, kind of 3 or 4 years ago. Now it's much more regular. What are you all seeing in your own practice, and observing, kind of, in your areas, in your geographic areas of concentration?
So I'm seeing, sadly, a lot of need for the residential because the kids are struggling with anxiety. Very sadly, I've had several kids that I've represented where they're on the spectrum, but they are not diagnosed
Mhm.
until high school.
Mhm.
And so they've got that, you have to look at the timing of they're now in high school
Mhm.
and the family's just learning this about them,
Mhm.
and they've got to learn how to function in the
Mhm.
world, with what Piper was talking about, that whole further education, employment, and independent living.
Mhm.
And so that's just so critical. And
Difficult, yeah,
that's,
yeah, at that stage, for sure,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And for me, what I've seen since I started doing this in, 2007 or whatever, that I remember thinking, oh, I have one case where the child has an emotional disturbance,
Mhm.
and the rest were all very focused on learning disabilities. And now I have to say that the learning disability as the primary focus is really much lower.
Yeah.
And it's all about that social emotional piece,
Yeah.
because the kids and younger,
Yeah.
they're just not doing well
Yeah.
socially and emotionally.
Yeah. Absolutely. Meredith?
Yeah, and a lot of times, speaking of what Gerry's talking about, that social and emotional piece develops because they haven't been identified in time, and they haven't gotten the services they need, and they get really frustrated with school, think they're stupid, think they can't learn, and they get, it becomes a problem. And I've seen too much more emotional disturbance in my office, and then it goes into all sorts of other things because, if you're depressed or very anxious, that also affects the frontal lobe and executive functioning and, all that kind
Mhm.
of stuff. Um, I My residential placements have been fairly steady. That's always been a pretty you know, significant part of my practice, and, you know, not always therapeutic. It's, you know, all kinds of things, you know, the older kid on the spectrum,
Yeah.
it's more transition.
Right. And that's a great point about the child that has dyslexia and still can't read when they're 14. You know, it's like they're not going to learn how to read at, you know, Staples High School. I mean, not to pick on Staples, but you know what I mean. And so like once you've gotten to kind of that point, I mean, it could be Greenwich High School, it could be whatever. It's like at the large public high school, it's very difficult to make that much remedial ground up, you know, when you're 14, 15 in the 4 years that you have left, given the structure that's available in that program. So that's a really, really good point about residential that, you know, I mean, we're talking a lot about mental health challenges and, you know, and whatever that, you know, that sort of late diagnosis or, you know, maybe the diagnosis happened, you know, at like age 8 or 9 and the kid just never got the right support and never learned how to read. And that's also the same, you know, type of problem.
Or it can be a low incidence disability too.
Sure.
So like my very first due process case was for a hearing impaired child, and I actually won placement at Clark,
Mhm.
you know, residentially, because there was no place around here that could do it. And I
Mhm.
got CREC, Soundbridge,
Mhm.
to do the evaluation and, you know, recommend the placement. But, you know, so those low incidence disabilities, there's, you know, blindness can also, you know, wind up getting you a residential placement in a very specialized school.
Mhm.
So there's those things too.
Paul Piper, that was interesting. I'm
So-
not sure who's next.
Oh, right. So I mean, you know, as you know, a lot of my practices, Christine, as you know, a lot of my practice is residential cases, always
I know.
has been. So I'm not, you know, kind of along the lines of Meredith. I'm not sure that I've seen
An increase.
I don't know if you've seen the increase. One thing I do wonder is I'm not sure that there's been an increase in mental health challenges or anything like that. I think that, I mean, certainly with the pandemic, there has been, but I think there's more awareness now. I think people are more willing, and families are thankfully, more willing to, you know, fight for their children to get therapeutic programs. I mean, it seems to get a little bit better every year, and you know that's a good thing. Districts hopefully are becoming more aware and more willing. I mean, I do feel that way, that when there's students with therapeutic needs, at least the cases that we're seeing, I don't know, you know, obviously we can't know what's going on with the majority of the population,
Yeah.
but that districts do seem to be willing to at least explore options, mostly day programs. You know, I mean, residential is still a fight and it's often a leap, but hopefully that the uptick is because there's just so much more awareness and
Right.
and acceptance and willingness to help.
Right. As opposed to an underlying. Piper?
I actually agree partly, but I actually think that there's been a systemic change in everyone from what's occurred. I think that parents were frightened. They saw what was really going on when their children were home. They became desperate and they saw things they didn't know. That it's hard to get evaluators, it's hard to get therapists. The teacher staff, they also have a life and they're really overwhelmed. So I see a lot more posturing and a lot more. I've had to actually work with a fair amount of my colleagues on the other side to try to hit a reset button. And I think people are exceedingly frustrated on all sides. And I think that and I've talked to therapists and neuropsychologists, and they're all reporting they're seeing things they've never seen before from a mental health perspective. And I think that we're going to have to set something up in these school districts with significant supports. And I think it's always wonderful if districts look to who some of the outside providers are and have them as consultants. I think there's going to be a lot of change.
Yeah. I have a question from an audience member that was asking, there really are not enough schools. And the schools that I know of, a lot of them are full. They're at capacity. So, this particular audience member, they're, like, and in other cases that I'm aware of where the child's been approved and there's no placement for them to go to. So, whether this reflects, an increase in mental health issues or increasing diagnosis of autism or increasing, diagnosis of anything, you bring up a good point, Piper. I mean, like, what do you all, I mean, obviously, like, I feel like there's not enough schools for the kids that are out there right now. What's your, sort of view on that?
I haven't seen that.
Okay.
I mean, I definitely see that. I mean, I actually think that in New York, I mean, I think having this system where the districts can only place in state approved programs and there's so few that are going to meet the need. I don't know how that is permitted under the IDEA. I mean, I can, my background was in New Jersey before I started in New York, and New Jersey has something called the Naples Act, which allows for districts to place in non-approved accredited schools if there are no approved schools available, and you just need either, in New Jersey, there's administrative law judges, either ALJ approval or a county superintendent approval. And in that situation, you can get it. So that opens up the universe of programs. But in New York, as an example, there's this constant issue of, I mean, I have a case right now where this family must have gotten 14 letters over the last 2 weeks. Nobody even doing any intakes, nobody doing for a residential school, nobody doing any intakes, because they don't have space. They're not even looking at the records. They don't have space. So it is, and I don't know if that is a problem with that
Particular I do agree school or, or
well, I don't know. I mean, to Piper's point, I think it's a good one. I mean, we're seeing, look, we've been through an extraordinary 2-year stretch, and that could have, I mean, very easily caused an increase. But it's also just that it's a problem that you've limited the number of options for families and frankly for districts. So I have board attorneys complaining about this all the time too, right. That they need to complete the IEP process. Their districts need to complete the IEP process, and they can't because they can't find a school.
Yeah.
I think, and I agree that happens, but I think but the next step then is, if they can't find it, you have to just keep moving further out, and, geographically or otherwise. I mean, there's, not that, I mean, what I see often with educational consultants is they're recommending across country. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's necessary all the time. But I do think that school districts, they have an obligation to find an appropriate placement. And if the schools, it's like throwing a stone, pebble in the water. And if you go the first level and there's nothing, you keep going. Mm-hmm. And that is how, in some cases I've been able to get students placed. Well, it's not a formal IEP placement. I guess that's the difference. Yeah. It's districts pay for it, but it's considered a parental placement. Mm-hmm. So it's more of a question of, is it if it has to be a placement, then there are a lot more constraints than if you can have a district work with you so the student can attend that program that's out of state. Because there's nothing locally, the district will pay for it, but it will be set up as a parental placement.
The Connecticut statute actually says that they can place, first in an approved school in Connecticut. Second, if there's nothing appropriate there, then they can move to a non-approved school in Connecticut. And then if there's nothing appropriate there, they can go outside of Connecticut. And so I've seen Connecticut districts place all sorts of places, and they don't even necessarily articulate that they're going through that process, mm-hmm. But, they've placed it non-approved. I've had non-approved placements via PPT in Connecticut. I've had them, outside of Connecticut. I just had one recently in California, from a Connecticut school district. So
Oh, wow.
yeah, so it can be done, but to get the school district to that point, your kid has been messed with really seriously. I
Mhm.
mean, seriously.
Yeah. I have a question from the audience. Actually, it's from Robin Keller. Hi, Robin. And it kind of segues into a question that I had, which is really about how residential settlements are structured. And this kind of goes back to, the thing that I was talking about before, which you told me not to talk about, which was the educational, the residential, and the medical piece. The question's kind of, what if a district claims that residential is necessary for medical reasons, not educational, and they'll only pay for like an educational piece of a placement, not the residential portion?
Well, I mean, I hear many times school districts out of PPT say, okay, you've unilaterally placed at a residential treatment center, we'll pay for the educational piece. And I'll say, great, pay for the educational piece, but we don't agree that you're not liable for the rest of it, and we'll fight you about the rest of it. And then, in negotiation, when you're trying to get reimbursement, I totally resist their insistence on slicing and dicing. They'll be like, okay, do you know how much the educational piece is? And most RTCs don't separate that out.
Mhm.
They have a really good one, maybe they did, and they put a whole bunch into education.
Yeah, I've
but-
seen that where like it's like the tuition is
So it depends.
70. It's like the
Also,
tuition is this,
RTC.
and then the residential is
well,
like a tiny little piece, and you're like,
because
okay,
educational is 60% of tuition. You're like, oh, here's the
yeah,
division.
here's the tuition. The residential is
So,
this tiny little like thing.
Otherwise, I basically say, no, I'm not gonna they don't separate this out. I'm not gonna separate this out. This kid needs the therapeutic piece in order to be educated. So you need to do the academic and the therapeutic, and they need the residential for XYZ reasons. So we can talk about whether you want to pay a piece of the whole number, but we're not going to start slicing and dicing it and letting you eliminate, okay, we're only going to negotiate on the basis of, the therapeutic and the educational, because we're going to pretend that's the only part that we could possibly be liable for. It's just a way for them to reduce the base of what they're negotiating on. And
Right.
I refuse to do that. I refuse to play that.
And for them to try to tell you to put it on insurance, like.
So that's
Yeah.
so that's the problem. So when the RTCs, to Meredith's point, they really do break it out, but when they do break it out, it's not for school district purposes, it's for insurance company purposes.
Yeah.
And so the therapeutic piece ends up being the larger component of it, which doesn't do any good for the family fighting against the school district. I did a presentation years ago now with to a bunch of residential schools, and the question they kept asking is, how could they help the families? And my response was, if you're going to break it out, make it 90% academic for the families. Their response is that they're not doing that for us. They're doing that for the insurance companies, and the insurance they want, and it's better for that purpose. It's better to have it more in the therapeutic piece. So I do this. I completely agree with what Meredith said. I don't let the district break it up like that, because once they do, we're negotiating. Now we're just negotiating over like the 33% or 40% academic number.
Right.
I mean,
and that's not helpful either.
No, it's a terrible place to start from.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the piece, right, is one of the pieces is, if you're not socially, emotionally, behaviorally regulated, you cannot learn. So the students in these therapeutic, or depending, that has to occur as part of a piece. So if they're like, the student's doing great, you'll hear like, oh yeah, they're doing great, they have A's. Well, what? They have no friends. They don't get invited anywhere. They don't go out of their house. They have suicidal ideations and eating disorder. They're lonely. They stay in the, what? So how are they going to function in the world? And that's when the therapeutic residential arguments come in, and why they're needed. That 24-hour milieu to continue to practice these skills.
That's helpful. Thank you. I had a, question about from the audience. Can someone on the panel review and explain the 10-day rule as it relates to funding for a, one residential placement to another, or one level of a program to another? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So are you saying when there's a change in the level of placement that a student requires, or?
I'm really just reading what the question is from the participant. It's a 10-day rule as it relates to funding, and if you have to provide a 10-day letter when you go from one residential placement to another, or even from one level program in a therapeutic residential placement to a different program in the same school or private facility.
From my perspective, I always err on the side of being conservative and saying to the parents, if we know this is happening, we provide the 10-day notice, or we provide notice, and it gives as many days as are practical, considering the first priority is the student. And if that student needs to be transferred and there is no time, we let them know afterwards. So they're giving notice if there's that change in the type of placement, or if it's a step down, or if it's the student is going from one placement to another placement. But the focus at that point is really about how much time are we able to give? Right. And I'm not as concerned that it has to be 10 business days. It has to be what that student needs. And then we've got to have again, you get back to the treaters and the evaluators, they have to support that. But
the initial, right? The initial unilateral placement, when you are taking them out of the school, that has to be the 10 days. Like, you have to do that, or it has to be at the PPT in Connecticut, one or the other.
Yeah.
But yeah, then I do the same thing as Gerry. I'm conservative about it. If I can give them notice that needs have changed and the placement is changing, I do that either before or after, but I don't think it's technically required by the statute, but I do it anyway.
So on this 10-day rule, I've had cases that come in, but there's been no 10 days given, and that's not a deal killer at all. The purpose of the law is the purpose of 10 days is whether the district was on notice in order to make changes. So if the district knew and all this was going on and you had to go, there's arguments for that. Or it can go, they can still have a PPT. They still have an opportunity. So I've have cases where the kids had to go, they give the notice, and then then they can have a PPT and fix it. That we're not saying the student's going to stay there. You just didn't provide anything and there was no choice. But if they had notice of all the persistent ongoing problems, that I have found can go a long way in constituting actual notice.
Instead of actually having notice. Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
I just want to throw one thing out there. So I completely agree. And I mean, the federal law, every state's corresponding regulations mirror the federal law on this. And, I mean, it really, everything about it is that you should be able to give notice through written notice or at an IEP meeting, whatever state you're in. And it's still even discretionary for the hearing officer to reduce or deny reimbursement. That being said, just because I know, Christine, you'd said that there may be people on the Zoom that are from various places. In certain jurisdictions, it not giving the notice is an outright bar to reimbursement. And so not in Connecticut or New York, but there's a New Jersey district court decision, which is wrong, but that it's an outright bar. And there's been other decisions. So I would just caution that anybody who's from a different jurisdiction, not Connecticut or New York, just be careful with that. And I just can't stress enough that what all four of us are saying, whoever is representing you, just be conservative when it comes to the 10-day notice. Give as much notice as possible, regardless of the situation. Just get it out there, because if you don't give notice, you're putting yourself in jeopardy.
Absolutely. That's helpful. There's a continued sort of thread in the chat about families that are unable to find placement for their students, like due to a wait list, like 2 to 3 year wait list, in New York for an approved school. What is your sort of advice for a family that isn't getting anywhere, where they're just kind of in a holding pattern with the school district really being unable to place them in an appropriate facility or educational environment due to lack of, waiting for over 2 years for a residential placement at a school seems like unbelievable, in this time when we need to be moving. So, what are your sort of, thoughts on what a family should do in that scenario?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a school. What?
Oh, I like what Gerry had to say before about that. Yeah, that
Ripple.
Yeah, keep moving, looking at every option.
It's a ripple. Yeah, you keep going.
Outside of New York, outside of, or whatever state, you just keep moving outside of the, I guess the radius, as it were. You just keep moving through the radius of options.
It also sounds like from what Meredith was saying in Connecticut, that it's possible to then get into, she got a placement in a non-approved program in California for a student. So it's about as far as you can go, right? So
yeah, pretty much.
Right now, I'm in the middle of a due process case where this kid is really complicated, both medically and educationally. She's just, she's one of a kind. And it's extremely hard to find a placement for her. And we've been trying for a long time. The school district, gave up immediately, and they're like, oh, we can't find a place because whatever. And my client wound up, hiring an educational consultant who has gone through like 50 programs, and we think we're honing in on one, right? But we were also running out of time. So I filed for due process, and I'm going to ask the hearing officer to force the school district to locate that, either, hire this ed consultant, locate the right program and place her, even though we haven't identified which one it is, because I can't wait. She can't wait.
Yeah.
She can't wait. I don't know if I'll win that, but that's what I'm going for. I don't know what else. I got to do something for this kid, and I don't know what else.
You actually bring up an interesting point, and with regard to educational consultants. I'm not sure that everyone on the call is familiar with an educational consultant and what they do, and how, like, particularly for someone who is out of options in their area, how they might be able to find something outside of their their radius area or whatever. Can really all of you chime in on educational placements? It's something for me that I've been educating myself on recently, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about it, about that, that particular role. Like, who is it, what do they do, and how do they best help families, and will school districts pay for them?
So I think
that was a lot. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think educational consultants are a real special niche for really hard to place students. I think that advocates, attorneys, people can often give you suggestions, but your evaluators can describe the type of a program if you're going locally. Once that ripple starts moving, as sort of, Gerry and Paul said, yeah, it gets tough to find placements, and you very much need to hire one of these experts. They know the programs throughout the country. They visited many of the programs. They know the directors. They can really help expedite a process. And there's some really wonderful ones around.
But some of them are sort of specialized in one kind of student, and others specialize in another kind of student. It depends. I have, some I like, and some that I'm not that impressed with,
Yeah,
So,
I agree. I think it's interesting too, because you can have, well, first of all, I think, Piper's comment about expediting. That's what I find is most critical for the kids, that there's no program within the state or, within an hour or two of where the student is. And that's where having the educational consultant is so critical, because they do know those programs and they know the people, and they're going to get your child's application
Into
in
the
front
program, exactly, in front of that, right.
of. Mhm.
They are
Um,
like really a conduit, it seems like, for, particularly
Yes.
for, your Utah, your California, whatever, type of specialized program, not a wilderness, but a specialized therapeutic, board. And honestly, really a lot of them are highly knowledgeable about, programs all across the country. And so can be a really good resources. But as, someone on the calls pointed out, what do you do if you can't afford this person? If you can't afford, $4,000 or $5,000, for this option, what is your, what's your option then if you're, if you're on the wait list in New York for an approved school for 2 years and you can't get into into a program that suits?
I think the New York lawyers have to take this one.
Well, I mean, I threw New York out there, but yeah.
I just think that it's, you just have to do the footwork then of, getting, just reaching out to programs.
Mhm.
And I know that a lot of the programs charge a fee just to submit an application, but not every one of them does that. And, they'll consider the circumstances. So, but it is really a lot of work, and it's a lot of work at a point for, the person who said, she's been trying to make this happen for 2 years. You're exhausted.
Mhm.
Your child is not getting what they need. So it's extremely difficult, and but you've got to get out there and just reach out to these programs.
And one way to do it is to, like, if there's a school, say, an approved school in New York that you thought, would work for your kid, but they're full, call them and ask them what other schools
Yeah,
serve
But
this.
like
that's a
you,
great
that's a
idea.
great idea.
That's
That's a great,
yep.
yeah.
If you apply to a school somewhere that you thought would fit, but they reject your kid for some particular reason, ask them, well, where do you think they would fit? What schools do you know about? Because they're all connected, they know each other, so
Right.
they're a good
Yeah.
way to.
I think the thing to keep in mind in New York is that even though that this rule is in place that they can only place in a state approved program, I mean, there is you can, the district can petition Albany, it takes forever, but there is like a difficult to place list. And I would actually say to a family, and this comes up, but like, go ahead and file, you can file pro se, file for due process, force the issue and get it. I haven't seen this happen because obviously I wasn't involved, but force the issue and put the pressure on the district to do it, because you're in a situation, what you're describing, which is upsetting to hear and not that surprising, that there isn't a placement available.
Yeah.
The district is out of options. You don't want to spend all the money, understandably, on an educational consultant. You shouldn't have to. The district's already agreed to an out of district placement. Why are you stuck having to, although I think it's really a good idea what Gerry said, to go, I mean, you got to do the legwork and look and try to find programs, but the district has their own educational experts and let them go out there, let them petition Albany. And if they're not doing that, I'd say file for due process. At least it's not wouldn't be what I would usually recommend, because you already have what you're looking for. But if they're not moving on, and
Right.
it sounds like it's been like 2 years, you got to take action. You got to, and the district has to do something to help your child.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's super helpful. Oh wait, I think that, the broad, the broad strokes of what we've been discussing here, have touched on, a number of different, we've touched on, the increasing, legal issues, the, increasing intransigence of the school districts towards, all pieces of this, of this process, of residential outplacement or outplacement in general. If you had to kind of, if you had a family today that was coming to you with, at the very beginning of this process, the child was in distress and they were looking at, and it's come on them all of a sudden and they need a residential outplacement, how would you direct them in, in this process?
Well, I mean, the first thing you figure out is, what are the financial resources? Because your strategy is going to depend on whether a unilateral placement is possible or not.
Mm-hmm.
If the family doesn't have the wherewithal for a unilateral placement, you're in a different, you're in a completely different place. The strategy, if you're going to unilaterally place, would be, let them propose the worst IEP you could think of, and don't help them make it better. And then you're defending against an IEP that stinks, which isn't hard, right?
Yeah.
If that's not what's going on, then you have a much harder road, actually, because you have to convince the school district that they don't have any way of serving this child. And so you have to do the full court press with as many, experts as you can, the psychiatrist, the therapist, an independent evaluator, whatever you can think of, and see if you can just kind of bludgeon them into
wear them down with, with your expert testimony. Yeah.
Yeah, but unfortunately, that's going to mean that this child is going to progressively go down the drain while this is happening.
Yeah. I mean, these are all cases which, obviously where time is of the essence. We've talked about that at length, and on many times when you're in that situation where there's suicidal ideation or, significant, mental health challenge, you can't wait for that. And you're looking to, so, obviously insurance is a way that, you can either get support, from, in the evaluation process, or, sometimes, on a short-term basis, in an intensive outpatient program or something like that can serve as sort of an interim, so do you see school districts funding those or not so much?
You mean for example,
Like an IOP? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have districts often with the cases that I've been, representing students on, they pretty often will fund an IOP because it is for people, it's an intensive outpatient program. And so, but what I find the difficult part of it is that they're few and far between. So again, you get back to that geographic issue of where the program is and where the family is.
Yeah.
And how do you make that work?
Yeah.
So.
Perfect. Well, I am so grateful to all of you for sharing your wisdom about this really, really important topic. It's kind of, it segues with a lot of different themes that we've been running with this year. One of which is mental health, which we talked about a little bit, and then the other of which is really understanding the different pieces of this sort of special education continuum, from the schools to the people that are involved in in determining a program. And we have touched on a lot of those topics today. It's been really, really insightful, for me, especially because I don't know anything about any of this. And I am really grateful to all of you for joining this tremendous discussion and sharing your thoughts and your wisdom about it. Thank you, Piper. Thank you, Gerry. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Meredith, for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone,
Yeah.
for joining.
much.
And as a reminder, our next webinar will be April 6th on mental health, special education, and the law. You know, the kids are not all right. And we're going to talk about that then. Thank you all so much for joining. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.